What happens when you cut a tech company off from everything? Processors, operating systems, app stores, and expect it to simply disappear. That's exactly what the American government tried to do in 2019. And by 2025, that same company had overtaken Apple in the world's largest smartphone market without a single American component, without a single line of American code. The sales gap was razor thin, a few 100,000 devices. Huawei slightly ahead, Apple slightly behind. On the surface, it looks like a routine market fluctuation. But behind that number is a story that turns everything we knew about technological power over the last 40 years completely upside down. To understand how this became possible, we need to go back to the moment when it seemed like Huawei no longer existed. In May 2019, the American government added the company to its sanctions list. Google immediately severed all ties. That meant the end of Android, Gmail, YouTube, Google Maps, and the Play Store on Huawei devices. For a smartphone manufacturer, losing Google is roughly the same as losing the engine at a car factory, but the sanctions went further. Any factory anywhere in the world that used American manufacturing equipment to produce chips was banned from working with Huawei. TSMC, the most advanced semiconductor fab on the planet, was caught in the crossfire. The partnership that had given Huawei some of the most competitive mobile processors in the industry was destroyed overnight by law. The consequences were immediate and brutal. In 2019, Huawei controlled around 17% of the global smartphone market. By 2021, that share had collapsed to below 3%. Leading tech publications called it one of the most effective technology sanctions in history. The strategy seemed to have worked perfectly. But while the rest of the world was writing Huawei's obituary, something else was happening inside China. Engineers were working at a pace that's hard to put into words. Problems that used to have simple solutions, just buy the right American component, had suddenly become challenges of national importance. Failure was not an option. The only path forward was to find a way. At this point, we need to take a step back and explain one key fact about modern electronics. There is a machine that virtually the entire global semiconductor industry depends on. It's made by the Dutch company ASML. This machine uses a specific type of light to etch incredibly fine patterns onto silicon wafers. Those patterns are measured in nanometers, hundreds of thousands of times thinner than a human hair. The smaller the pattern, the more computing power fits onto a single chip. Without ASML machines, it's impossible to produce the world's most advanced chips. The American government had spent years working with the Netherlands to prevent China from accessing the most advanced versions of this equipment. The logic was airtight. No machine, no advanced chips, no competitive smartphones. The circle seemed closed. And yet, in August 2023, Huawei quietly, almost without announcement, released the Mate 60 Pro. When technical researchers tore the device apart, the industry froze. The Chinese fab SMIC had developed a way to repeatedly layer older manufacturing processes on top of each other, and in doing so, achieve a level of precision that was considered unattainable without the banned equipment. It was like being told you can't build a skyscraper without a tower crane. And then 3 years later you show up, and the skyscraper is standing right in front of you, built with ladders and ropes. It wasn't supposed to work, but it did. The launch date was telling. The phone went on sale on the exact day the American Secretary of State was in Beijing for trade negotiations. That was no coincidence. In November 2025, Huawei unveiled the Mate 80 Pro Max, powered by the Kirin 930 Pro processor. Independent tests confirmed the claimed 42% performance improvement over the previous generation. The specs were closing in on the level of chips Apple had been releasing a few years earlier. But more important than the specs was something else. Every stage of that processor's creation, design, manufacturing, testing, packaging took place inside China. For the first time in years, a flagship smartphone had been built entirely beyond the reach of American export controls. But the processor is only part of the story. In 2019, every smartphone on the planet ran on one of two operating systems, Android from Google or iOS from Apple, both American. Before Huawei, many had tried to build an alternative. Microsoft spent billions on Windows Phone. Samsung poured resources into Tizen. Nokia developed MeeGo. All of them failed. The reason wasn't software quality, The reason was a trap. Nobody wanted to write apps for a platform with no users, and nobody wanted to use a platform with no apps. A perfect closed loop. When Google cut off Huawei in 2019, the industry almost unanimously assumed the company would take the open-source version of Android and keep going on a slightly modified system. Early versions of Harmony OS looked exactly like that. But on October 22, 2024, Huawei launched Harmony OS Next, and it was an entirely different story. All Android code was removed. The Linux kernel gone too. Huawei wrote the operating system from scratch on its own kernel called Hongmeng. The compiler, proprietary. The development tools, proprietary. The programming language, ArcTS, also built in-house. Every layer of the software stack, from the deep kernel all the way up to the interface under the user's fingertip, was new and contained not a single line of American origin code. But an operating system without apps is just an expensive calculator, and that trap still had to be navigated. Harmony OS Next launched with 10,000 native apps. For comparison, the App Store has over 1.5 million, and Google Play has over 3 million. The gap seemed insurmountable, but Huawei wasn't trying to win a global app count competition. It was playing a completely different game. Instead of chasing Apple and Google across every front, the company focused on one very specific question. Which apps does a person living in China actually need every day? What makes a phone genuinely usable in that society? The super app for messaging and payments was rebuilt natively for Harmony OS Alipay, rebuilt. The Chinese version of TikTok, rebuilt. Apps for all major Chinese banks, rebuilt. The National Tax Authority's app, rebuilt. These aren't entertainment or conveniences. This is the infrastructure of daily life. If they run on your phone, you can function in modern Chinese society. By November 2025, Harmony OS had 300,000 native apps. By March 2026, the number had already surpassed 350,000, and the pace kept growing. In the final quarter of 2024, Harmony OS was running on 19 out of every 100 actively used smartphones in China, iOS 17. For the first time in the history of the modern smartphone, an operating system not of American origin had overtaken iOS in the world's largest market. To understand why this matters beyond market statistics, you need to grasp the principle that underpinned American technological dominance for 4 decades. The principle was simple. Wherever in the world you built a tech product, at least one critical element was always American. Building a smartphone, you needed Qualcomm chips or production at TSMC using American equipment. You needed Android or iOS. You needed Google Play or the App Store. You needed American cloud infrastructure, American development tools, American server solutions. Somewhere in the chain, there was always an American layer. And that gave strategic leverage. If a company or country moved in an unwanted direction, there was always one thread that could be cut. That system operated without any serious challenge for an entire generation. It worked against Huawei in 2019, swiftly, decisively, and with devastating effect. Now look at what Huawei had assembled by 2025. Its own chip design division, manufacturing at SMIC, an operating system on its own kernel, its own compiler, its own development tools, its own programming language, its own app store, its own cloud services. Every layer, from chip design to the interface on the screen, exists without the involvement of American companies. There is not a single thread left to cut. The strategy that nearly destroyed Huawei in 2019 can no longer be applied against it in 2025. The company that existed 6 years ago no longer exists. What replaced it is something the tech world has never seen before. A consumer electronics manufacturer operating on a fully independent, fully domestic platform at the scale of hundreds of millions of devices. That is what Apple ran into in China. Not a cheaper phone, not a better camera. A fundamentally different set of rules. The iPhone 16 was technically competitive. But the unspoken protection that had held Apple's position for years, the belief that any Chinese competitor was always one political decision away from paralysis, that protection quietly dissolved. In early 2025, Apple responded with rare and significant discounts. They helped at the margins. They didn't change the direction. And the consequences of this shift extend far beyond the smartphone market. If you're interested in following how the global tech balance is shifting, subscribe to the channel and hit like. It helps us make more content like this.